Mikhail Gorbachev, a statesman, the last Soviet leader, and the one who ended the Cold War that brought the world to the brink of a nuclear confrontation without any bloodshed, died at the age of 91 after prolonged illness. But much like his legacy, his death also received sharply divided reactions. In the West, Gorbachev was revered. Western leaders and some Russians hailed him for bringing the Iron Curtain down and for ending years of Cold War. But many Russian hardliners and others reviled him for the very same thing, blaming him for letting the Soviet Union collapse. After his death, the Kremlin hailed Gorbachev as a statesman who will go down in history, but said his romanticism about prospects for a reconciliation with the West had been misplaced.
He sincerely wanted to believe that the Cold War will end an eternal romantic period between the new Soviet Union and the world. The collective West, as we call it, comes. That romanticism was not justified. There was no romantic period or a honey-sweet century. The bloodthirstiness of our opponents showed itself.
The last Soviet leader was credited with key political and economic reforms to the USSR. In 1985, when he became the head of the Communist Party, he pursued an economic policy that aimed to increase growth while increasing capital investment. He brought in two reforms, Perestroika, which means restructuring, and Glasnost, which means openness. Perestroika involved deeper structural changes to create a semi-free market economy, and Glasnost involved opening up of the political system, essentially democratizing it. His goal was clear, bringing the Soviet Union up to par economically with the West. He even traveled abroad extensively and was successful in convincing leaders of the West that the USSR was no longer an international threat. When Gorbachev lifted the Iron Curtain, Western businesses rushed in. In early 1990s, American brands flocked into Moscow and St. Petersburg, a stark contrast to the Russia of today under Vladimir Putin. In January 1990, crowds of Russians lined up in Moscow's Pushkin Square for the opening of the country's first McDonald's. Economic reforms by Gorbachev opened floodgates for multinationals that had been entirely shut out of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And in the years that followed, Russians developed an appetite for American fast food, cars, and clothing. But in 2022, this era that lasted about 3 decades has come to an abrupt halt. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has prompted over 1,000 Western companies, including McDonald's, to exit the country. The Starbucks chain has been replaced by Star Coffee. All this under Putin's leadership. To put it simply, the relationship between Gorbachev and Putin has been complicated. Putin had famously called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Gorbachev also struggled to make up his mind about Vladimir Putin. In over 20 years after Putin came to power, the former Soviet leader embraced, rejected, and then embraced Putin again, who, much like Gorbachev in the 80s, came to embody Russia in the eyes of the West. When Putin was elected president in the year 2000, Gorbachev said he represented a chance for stability and economic growth. But as the years went by and hopes of democratic development in Russia evaporated, Gorbachev turned to veiled criticism and then to strongly worded attacks. In the 2011 election, Gorbachev hardened his attitude against Putin and backed protest movements that followed the election. But in 2014, it looked like Gorbachev had a change of heart when he supported Moscow's seizure of Crimea from Ukraine. And in 2018, the two seemingly developed a grudging respect for each other. Ahead of Putin's re-election for a 4th term, Gorbachev said Putin is a leader who deservedly enjoys people's support. When Gorbachev stepped down at the end of 1991, the NATO-Soviet frontier was no longer a flashpoint. NATO pulled all but a few thousand troops back from the eastern flank. The terrors of the Cold War seemed consigned to history books. Today, Ukraine, once part of the USSR, is a major flashpoint between Russia and the NATO. The alliance has its troops back eastwards. The former Soviet leader was a champion of arms control. He even discussed elimination of nuclear weapons with Ronald Reagan in 1986. And now there is a cloud over the last remaining agreement between the US and Russia limiting nuclear weapons. And the threat of a nuclear war has intensified to a level not seen since the Cold War. Ironically, Mikhail Gorbachev lived long enough to see everything he had achieved be destroyed by a man whom he might have come to respect but never trusted, Vladimir Putin.
Feierlichkeiten teilnehmen.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.